Welcome to Truth and Trolls, dealing with toxic speech while protecting free speech online. I think that this is a really interesting and timely topic, and we have this fantastic panel here to talk through some of the issues with us. You have, or can get, if you would like, some bios. They're also on the website. I'll give a quick context. My name's Heather West. I work at a company called Cloudflare. We protect and accelerate the performance of websites online. Although we don't host any websites, and we don't have the kind of user-generated content that you see here. We are often grappling with the idea that there's speech online that we don't like, but we are thankful for all of the experts here who are working on how to make speech safer online and help create helpful community and dialogue. So to my right is Courtney with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Obviously, right in the epicenter of free speech and making sure that there's productive conversation online. Greg Barber with the Washington Post and the Coral Project, which is developing best practices for engagement in this kind of a community. Tanya, who is with Global Voices and has a great perspective into kind of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Jennifer Hanley with the Family Online Safety Institute works a lot with platforms to think about best practices for all sorts of speech. And Laura Ballard with the State Department, although, as I am sure she will reiterate, speaking for herself, who can tag is IGF-USA _trolls. I'm going to be checking Twitter every once in a while, so if you have any questions you'd like me to ask, please let me know. We will also be taking questions if there's anything particularly timely, pop up and ask. So one of the things that I think would be really helpful is just to kind of set a baseline for what kind of toxic trolling we're talking about. Because I think that while people may have one particular incident in mind, I think that there's a very diverse set of speech that we are talking about when we think about trolling and toxic speech online. Courtney, I think that you would be a great person to start talking about that.
Sure. So, I think trolling can take a variety of different types of characteristics, but what we see at the Committee to Protect Journalists in terms of trolling their authority and integrity as a journalist. Obviously, journalism depends on one's reputation and credibility, and so trolling can aim to diminish or destroy that, which obviously has broader implications for the journalistic field. It can also be used to hijack and destroy conversations that are happening around a newsworthy topic or around an issue that people are interested in expressing themselves about. Some of my research in the Arab region has shown that trolling is being used against women journalists and activists, and specifically using sexual tropes to delegitimize them, to destroy their reputations. We've also seen in the United States that journalists, most recently those covering Gamergate or those involved in covering technology, have been victims of trolling, which has included things like doxing, which is essentially giving out personal information like social security numbers or addresses, which can put people at risk, and real threats online. And the thing is, when you are a journalist and you're hearing over and over from both anonymous as well as non-anonymous people that I don't want to use those words, especially because we're being live streamed, but really horrible threats around rape, around death, around horrible ways to be killed, that has a real impact on your ability to do your job. We have anecdotal reports of people who have left the profession because they couldn't bear those attacks, and that has broad implications for society at large. There's a woman named Lamis Daif, for example, in Bahrain, and Amir al-Husseini, who was a Global Voices blogger, who are the victims of trolling. And, it takes different forms. So in some countries like Bahrain, we see that they're very sophisticated government trolls that specifically go out after and use legitimate information to try to undermine authority, whereas other places like Syria and other countries, it's just trying to overtake and flood a hashtag or flood a conversation so you can't even have that conversation. So, trolling takes many, many forms. I think we'll get into more details, but I want to...
Yes, no, I think, Greg, you obviously also see a lot of this in your job with community engagement at the Washington Post. Can you talk a little bit about what you see there? I think it's much more U.S. specific, but still obviously very relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the problems that Courtney was talking about on the world stage are can be seen in what we see at the Washington Post. As you mentioned, I'm also working with a group called the Coral Project, and that's a group that it's a partnership between the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Mozilla. We're funded by a grant from the Knight Foundation, and our goal there is to create open source software and renew best practices that will help publishers better connect with their audiences and hopefully stamp out some of the kinds of trolling that Courtney was talking about. At the Washington Post, we see there's a lot of talk about organized trolling. We see a lot of disorganized trolling. It doesn't have to be a government to cause a lot of trouble. It can just be one particularly virulent person who's trying to dislodge a conversation, and it makes our job difficult, what we're trying to do at the Post. And with the Coral Project, actually, I've talked with dozens of publishers who have kind of the same experience that we do. What we're trying to do in our interactive spaces, comment sections being the most conspicuous kind, is have a conversation and allow more voices than just ours and the people that we've gone out to talk to be able to weigh in on the news. What we've heard from readers is that this kind of interaction is really important to them. It's a way for people to see that there are more thoughts than just what's happening in this story, that what this journalist was able to gather together. That there's a range of thoughts, that there's a range of experiences around different news items or different topics. And so we feel like it's very important for us to be a place where people can talk openly about the news, safely about the news, and trolls help to derail that. So we spend a lot of time and energy trying to make those spaces safer and more robust, and we're hoping that our work at the Coral Project will make that easier for publishers across the board.
I think that there's, so we've talked a little bit about that there's a great diversity of these kind of trolling comments and content. What kinds of platforms are implicated here? Just everything?
Yeah,
obviously, news sites.
Wherever the conversation happens, you get trolling. And very often it's really hard to gauge how effective trolling is because of, how big is the conversation. But depending on the country, in the US, obviously, in terms of social media, Facebook and Twitter are the biggest players. And then, the comment sections, that's why, there's a saying, never read the comments. That's because of stuff that happens in the comments. But obviously, the more prominent the platform is and the more salient the issue is, the more chances there are that trolls will be there either to derail the conversation, as Greg said, or to sort of redirect it into the vein that they want it to proceed in, and to sort of almost reframe the story. Which is weird to think about for journalists, but it is very easy for a journalist to lose control of the story if trolls descend and say, well, no, actually, this is what's happening here. That's, you're wrong here, and this is what's important. So that might also happen, and that trolling might also lead to that.
And Jennifer, I know that you work a lot with companies who are running these platforms to think about how best to address this and create the community online in whatever context. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with FOSEA, we're an international nonprofit, and we're dedicated to making the online world safer for kids and their families. while also respecting free expression. So we're not saying limit everything. We're not saying all commenting and all of that is bad. But we want to make sure that people have a safe and positive experience. And as Heather pointed out, we work with a lot of companies, and we provide advice and work on best practices around how to promote cyber civility. So we look at things like toxic speech, like trolling. We look at cyberbullying and cyber harassment, particularly when it comes to teens and young people and how they're affected by this online. We also advise new startups and other companies who are just getting into this space and kind of not quite sure what to expect when they open up a comment section or other things like that. And some of the things that we really suggest and hope that companies do is have a comprehensive set of policies to begin with. Really think about the values that they have as a company, the type of speech they want to foster on their sites, their services, and platforms. In addition to having a really good set of policies, we want to encourage them to have an adequate team in place to enforce these policies, to really quickly review when people report or need to block something. So those are just some of the basic steps that we want, is that comprehensive policy, enforcement mechanisms and tools, and a dedicated team to think about these issues.
Okay, but can I ask you a question? Aren't you concerned about devolving that decision about what is acceptable speech to private companies that don't have accountability mechanisms? So we're increasingly, I think, moving towards the privatization of censorship, where we're saying, okay, we're no longer going to do this in a system of, a legal system where there are rules of procedure and accountability and due process, and we're going to move it to the private sector where there is a lack of transparency. There is, the only accountability is if you happen to be a publicly traded company and you're a stockholder, but even then that, in my opinion, doesn't really count as accountability. So how do you balance that?
I think some of the accountability comes from the fact that if one, it's a negative environment, people are going to leave their service. They're going to end up losing users that way, and that might also stifle free expression, because if people are being trolled so much, they're not going to want to be on the service either. I think that there's increasing transparency where companies are trying to say, this is what we're doing. These are the guidelines for how we expect behavior on our platforms. So we encourage that. We don't want people kind of hiding everything behind closed doors, and using their websites, their terms of service, and their policies to publicly state what's considered acceptable behavior, I think, is a good step in that direction.
Do you encourage them to report on what they're doing in that realm so that there is transparency?
We do encourage transparency. We don't encourage them to report to governments necessarily or anything. But we do encourage also, when they're using blocking mechanisms and stuff, education to make sure that they're talking to users. And I'm thinking particularly of young teens who are engaging in negative behavior online, encouraging them to use steps to intervene and say, you're being blocked because of X. This was a negative behavior, and trying to use that as a teaching moment for their users to educate them on kind of what's more appropriate online behavior.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the best practices that the companies might take. I think Laura has kind of a perspective into some of the actions that governments are taking internationally. Can we make sure that Mike is a little bit
move that over.
Is close enough that the video?
Sure. Well, as I was listening to this last back and forth, it occurred to me that this isn't necessarily an either-or proposition, where it's either government or private industry, because I think what you have often is a system of co-regulation where industry is expected to regulate up to a point, but then there are these outer boundaries. When you mentioned the doxing, actually, I thought of a recent domestic incident. There's a prevalent news story, mostly among right-wing oriented sites about this couple in Oregon who owns a bakery, and then they were fined $130,000 because they refused to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. Well, the same-sex couple has finally come forward and told their story, and it's actually kind of a doxing case. So they weren't fined for refusal to bake a cake. They were fined because they revealed this couple's name and address to a bunch of right-wing blogs, and then this lesbian couple started getting death threats, which was kind of a big deal because they have foster children.
Actually, before we get into that's very relevant to one of the comments here. Before we get into the international side, it's been pointed out on Twitter. Is there a difference between trolling and things like death threats, harassment, doxing?
Difference of degree, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's all abusive behavior. Essentially, it's just what it might lead to, both online and offline, I think, is the difference.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, my point was simply that, yes, there's this area where the companies are actually, I guess you could call it privatizing censorship or what you will. The companies have certain standards that they will enforce on their site. but they may be doing it for their own reasons. They may be doing it to cultivate a type of conversation or a certain mojo on a particular site, but they're also doing it with an awareness of this sort of outer boundary of law where if something crosses a line, then they could be facing legal liability. So as is often the case, and I'm more of a privacy expert, but we see that in privacy is what we call co-regulation. It's, you give the company kind of a safe harbor if they can mind the store, but then there are these sort of outer limits.
And then I think that also circles back to the question that you just asked, which was, is there a difference between trolling and something like death threats? I mean, trolling would be the kinds of things that would be regulated by a site's discussion policy. Death threats, that's when you get into the legal space,
right?
And there's obviously sort of a bigger burden there.
And certainly, I expect there's a broad spectrum covering, from the relatively just annoying to the very threatening.
Yeah.
Well, and also, I mean, when we're talking about trolling, usually we're talking about people who are trying to manipulate a conversation, and it can be, as in the case of Bahrain, for example, where it's, trying to be persuasive. So it's actually trying to manipulate so that people who come across it, might actually believe what's being said. And then, we hear a lot of criticism, obviously, of China, of the, Iran, the 50-cent bloggers, the people who are paid to post comments. But, there's this whole countering violent terrorism initiative going on and efforts by democratic governments, including the United States and Israel, where bloggers and social media users are paid to post positive comments or, counteract some discussions in certain fora. So do we consider that trolling? How do we consider, how do you differentiate? Is it just if a country is democratic or not democratic?
Well, it's interesting because I think what that raises is the idea of an independent actor versus, a set of actors working for a state interest or some other interest. One of the things that I think would be really interesting to hear, because, so on the one side, maybe the United States and other governments that we might consider relatively friendly are doing that. I know that there's a lot going on, especially in Russia and Ukraine, that you can speak to, Tanya.
Yeah, and I'd say that I don't think really there's much of a difference between whether it's a democratic government or not doing it, because, for all we know, a Russian government thinks of itself as democratic. They might want to think that way. But Russia's sort of been really instrumental recently at the internet for a very long time was the freest medium, whereas all the other traditional mainstream media have been slowly but surely co-opted by the state. The internet remained a kind of a bastion of free expression where people, were allowed to say what they want, and they still are to a large extent. I mean, certainly there are some repressive laws that have been passed, but people are still sort of saying what they want. But the trolling that's happening, and especially the sort of, because there's, again, as it's been pointed out, there are, of course, individuals who go and troll people, and there are some who do it very well and have huge followings, and, they're very good at it. But there's also organized trolling, which has been, by some journalists, tied to the state. And these are essentially, offices full of people who work shifts, and all they do is they get talking points, and they post comments on blogs. They post blog posts where, among the sort of regular blog posts, they insert political statements, whether they're positive towards the ruling power or negative towards the opposition or the U.S. or the West. And the point there is, it's not just to come in and be mean. It's to derail the discussion, and that's the problem. And again, we don't know how effective these are, but they're certainly polluting the free expression that still exists in Russia. And this has become evident, especially because of the conflict in Ukraine, because, this has been a very hot topic. And so Russian government obviously has a lot of opinions, and it wants people to think in a certain way. And so they go not just on the Russian internet, but also on the Western internet. They go into comment sections on The Guardian. There are English language teams working on this. And, journalists in Russia have been really good at finding people who worked in these offices, getting them to leak, account lists, getting them to leak the rules, the talking points, how many posts they're supposed to post today. So this is all, this is all known to us. But that still doesn't negate the fact that it's out there and that it's still happening. And, whenever some major news story runs, like when one of the Russian opposition politicians was killed, Boris Nemtsov, you could see immediately like dozens and hundreds of Twitter accounts tweeting the same thing, like literally the same sentence. And if you knew where to look, you could see this activity happening. And certainly this might not be as toxic as death threats or abuse, but it's still polluting the conversation, and it's still changing sort of the mindset of people who might not necessarily be able to tell that these are not real people, and who think that this. So it's less dangerous, certainly it's less threatening, but it's also more insidious, and I think.
Well, it's interesting. What this reminds me of, and this is something that shows that my background isn't necessarily on the speech side, but on the kind of privacy and transparency side. I can't remember how long ago, it was a year or two ago, that the FTC started requiring transparency from bloggers in the US who were blogging on behalf of some product or advertiser. Clearly that's not something we can enforce globally, but what kinds of best practices like transparency, or what kind of platform best practices might be helpful here? I think we can start with the really hard case, Russia and Ukraine, and what you're seeing there. Is there a technical way to see what they're doing, or is there some other thing that you would ask for?
I think good investigative reporting, and certainly, I wouldn't say that the reporting that's already been done on this has changed everyone's minds or opened people's eyes, but some people have reacted to it, and just that people are at least aware of the fact that this is happening, and there's a certain kind of post-Soviet mindset towards the media in Russia and Ukraine and some other countries. If the media says it, then it must be true. And the internet hasn't enjoyed the same level of trust, but it's been enjoying more and more, because you can actually now see that you can find all of these new different viewpoints online. So
the audiences reading these blogs and seeing all of these kind of, whether they know they're sponsored or not, are they critical of the content? Do they kind of understand what's going on? Or
some are, some aren't.
Yes, some aren't.
Again, because this is made to look like regular sort of internet use and regular internet people posting comments. Sometimes you can tell. Like sometimes it's just ridiculously obvious. But then again, we as journalists, like we see more, and we're not the.
And there is a section in the State Department that does the social media production in Arabic specifically.
There's one for Russian too.
Yeah, and Russia. And I know in the Arabic one that they are supposed to identify themselves. So, that at least then gives the person a perspective. I don't think that was the case in Israel during the Gaza war in terms of, trying to identify themselves. But I think that is, one potential best practice, so that you recognize, who's making that speech.
And I think, just to jump in there, that the FTC has actually put out additional guidelines this year on having people disclose when they have partnerships or sponsorship and things like that. And I also think it's really important, we take it from a digital literacy and digital citizenship perspective, that like teaching kids to think really critically, and young adults, about what they're seeing online. We deal with this with the extremism and radicalization side of things, but just overall, so that young people know when they're going online that they don't need to believe everything that they're seeing. They need to think critically about who's posting it, who they might be affiliated with. And I think getting that message through at a younger age is really important as kids engage online.
Well, and I think it's an important skill for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There seems to be a live issue here with regard to online comments, and I'm seeing it as much, in Europe as here, which is, what is the value of anonymous free speech, and is that what we want in any particular context? Certainly the U.S. government and U.S. Supreme Court strongly support anonymous. The value of anonymous free speech is protected under the First Amendment. But it sounds like what we see time and again with online comments, and not just from a legal or human rights perspective, but also from the business perspective, is that forcing people to identify themselves changes the conversation. And maybe it changes it for the good, maybe it changes it for the bad. Again, there is a value for anonymous free speech, but I'd be curious, what some of your experiences have been with, what about, online commenting changes when you require someone to register or have an account or even a pseudonym that's consistent?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that can be helpful with a pseudonym that's consistent, at least some level of consistency, is that there can be a quality increase. But let me take a step back. I've worked on internet forums that have that sort of, I guess, require a real name in the sense that we used Facebook comments, and then I've worked on forums that haven't. And the Washington Post currently, you can set up an account. You do need an account of some kind in order to comment. You don't have to use a real name. You can use a pseudonym. And I've really not seen a difference in quality. I know that that's a thing, and that there are people in my business that think that using Facebook comments or using real names automatically equates to better, a higher level of civility, or that's just not been my experience. Because I think everybody in the audience might be able to pop on Facebook and find that one relative who puts that stuff up that you kind of just squint at a little bit, or block. Everybody's got one, and they're all out there on the internet doing other stuff too. So. So I mean, that's the experience that we had. I had a colleague actually who ran a site that used Facebook comments, and his response to it was Facebook comments kill discourse. So there was a big. There's definitely a difference in thought there. As far as though creating some space where someone would be able to, rather than sort of writing notes on blades of grass, actually create a persona, create something that's larger. I think that actually can really help as far as the level of civility goes. Not necessarily saying, "Hi, I'm Greg Barber and this is my picture," but just saying, "I'm this person and what I'm interested in talking about is this," and being able to gather a community and gather a following. It means that everybody kind of has a little bit more skin in the game, and I think that can be really helpful.
I think it's also important to note that the right for anonymity and its link to free expression is not American. It's actually recognized in the latest report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion, who just did a report on encryption and anonymity as a right that enables your enjoyment of freedom of expression, which is a fundamental human right outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as your right to enjoy privacy. And so I think it's important that we consider that, and also consider that policies designed to limit anonymity don't only impact trolls or the negative sense, but in so many of the parts of the world where we work, it is very important that people are able to get information out or participate or report on things and do that anonymously because they face great risk. I mean, the past 3 years have been the most dangerous on record for journalists, with record numbers killed and imprisoned, oftentimes for reporting on corruption by politicians. You probably think most of that's in crossfire, and it's not. Most journalists are murdered because of their reporting. So I think that we have to, and that's why this panel is great, is really calibrate the policies so that it enables people in the most repressive environments where that sort of reporting is really critical, but also enables people to feel safe and doesn't, it's a very complicated issue because on the other hand, we don't want journalists who are pressured to stop reporting or to stop participating because of trolling. So, we have to find a way to strike a balance.
Yeah, I would agree with both Courtney and Greg here and say that, policy is only great as a tool when it works not just for its own interests, but for the interests of the people who it's aimed at. And so if you tweak the policy enough that you can have anonymity and you can have, preserving privacy, but that you're also able to create some sort of community where its own policing starts to occur. Because, once people start to sort of see each other and they see the histories of engagement, then people start seeing, they just troll. That's all they do. That's all this person does. And so that creates a level of understanding within the community, however big or small it is, of who the players are. Mm-hmm. And that allows the community itself to sort of, police, to cleanse, to engage with each other on knowing who the actors are, if not the actual people at least.
Right. I think that we've talked a lot about what platforms might do and how platforms are thinking about policing this, but even just the word policing brings to me, all right, so where's the government action? What are governments and how are governments thinking about this? Laura, I know that there was a case in Europe, Delphi versus Estonia, that has given some, American-style free speech proponents pause. I think that many of us, and I would include myself in that statement, maybe don't understand it particularly well.
Okay.
It'd be great if you could talk through that.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's a very interesting case, and this is a little quirk I picked up in law school, which is that I find that when I'm discussing a court opinion, it helps to read the court opinion. It's like, and
There's my mistake.
It's a long opinion, but it's well worth a read. You'll learn a lot. Yeah. I mean, the first thing, I think a lot of Americans probably don't even realize that the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice are not the same court. So the European Court of Human Rights is a Council of Europe institution. The Council of Europe has 47 member states that include Ukraine, Russia, plus all of the EU. And the way that their jurisprudence often comes about, they're interpreting the European Convention on Human Rights. And they often approach it as if they're sort of setting a floor for human rights, and they give the member states a lot of deference. And in this case, the member state was Estonia. That's also interesting because if you're looking for a European ally who values free speech online, you'd be hard-pressed to find one better than Estonia. So for us to be negative about this case, you've got to realize that what you're negative about is a decision of the the Estonian Supreme Court that the European Court of Human Rights didn't disturb. But what's also interesting about the case, and it would be an interesting contrast with how someone like Washington Post handles online comments, is that, it's an essentially similar business model. And the case, in the end, turns on what kind of business model is this? And, to what degree do you have to take responsibility for user comments of various types, depending on your own moderation policies and how you sort of align yourself with them. So Delphi was an internet news portal, still is, very successful. They promulgate about 330 articles a day. And in January 2006, they ran an article about a ferry service that had destroyed an ice road. And so, there's all these outlying islands in Estonia, and, the water freezes over in the winter, and there are these public ice roads. And then there's also this ferry service. So there's nothing wrong with the article. It was a fair and balanced article. But it got 185 comments. And apparently people feel really strongly about this ferry service. It sounds like, DC Metro, red line at rush hour. So they just hate these guys. And so about 20 of these 185 comments contain varying degrees of offensive language and threats of varying degrees towards the majority shareholder of this ferry company, who we only know as L. That's how he's identified in the European Court of Human Rights decision. So some of these comments say things like, they bathe in money thanks to state subsidies, burn in your own ship, you sick Jew. They say that L should go into the oven. They say that L deserves to be lynched. Lynching is what he deserves. And these comments stay up until around March of 2006, so about 6 weeks. Now this company did have a user policy. They said, we don't appreciate hate-filled language, and and they did moderate in the sense that you have to put your comment has to be germane to the article that you're commenting on. So they did have a capacity to moderate and a willingness to moderate. They also had all the usual disclaimers: we don't take responsibility for these comments. And this Delphi at that time had a reputation for a sort of rough and tumble comment section. They seemed to cultivate it. They liked it. They left that. They liked being kind of edgy. It was like, kind of like Reddit on steroids, which is a little scary because I think Reddit is already on steroids. But so Reddit on steroids. And so people were kind of getting tired of it. It was pushing the boundaries, but it attracted traffic to their site. So L, in March of 2006, tells them to take down all these comments, and also he wants 32,000 euros in damages. And they said, well, we'll take it down right away, of course, but we're not liable for damages because we're an information society service, which is how the EU law, of which Estonia has a law that is pursuant to an EU directive, defines basically an internet intermediary. So they go to the trial court in Estonia, and the trial court says, okay, well, you're a content provider and a publisher with regard to the article, but you're an intermediary with regard to the comments. So we're not going to find liability here. This gets overturned on appeals. It goes back to the trial court, and they said, no, they're not an information society service. We're not splitting the baby. They're a publisher. They're a content provider. The comments are relating to the article. They're ginning up traffic to the article by curating these comments. So they end up getting fined 320 euros. Okay, and they take this all the way back up to the Estonian Supreme Court that basically is interpreting Estonian law. Well, then Delphi, and there are a couple of civil society organizations that got involved, they took this to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights said, okay, we're going to look at Estonia's approach to these issues and see if it violates Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And they decide the test is it lawful? Is it a good due process, pursuant to rule of law? And is it necessary in a democratic society? And so again, that sort of sets a floor that leaves a lot of leeway for the states to come up with variations. So they rule in favor of Estonia. They say, okay, Estonia's approach to this is not unlawful or unheard of or violating free expression. There are 2 judges who dissent, and the dissent is worth reading too, because they actually talk about the importance of intermediary immunity going back to like the 18th century with Jonathan Swift, and he published a satire, and they went after the publisher instead of Jonathan Swift, even though they knew it was him. The case also got into issues about anonymity. One of the things the court was looking at was sort of the difficulty of this guy L coming after the commenters themselves because they're not easily identified. So it gives you a pretty good roadmap of the kinds of things to do if you're trying to avoid liability for that sort of thing in Europe. I would also say if you're going to bring a test case for free speech in Europe, I would try to do it on something other than anti-Semitic death threats. I find that that's, Europe doesn't have the same free expression standards that we do all the time. And that tends to be where they'll often draw the line. The swastikas, the anti-Semitic comments, there's a history there, we don't share it. There are just certain times that we part ways with those guys. So that's that case.
Interesting, and you're right. That's not the test case that's going to go well for free speech proponents.
Yeah.
I would like to hear some reactions.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm writing down all of the questions that are coming through on Twitter. Thank you. Keep it up.
Yeah, I think one of the key things here, apart from this sort of setting a very worrying precedent, and that's why everybody's kind of reacting in such a shocking way, is this idea of, who is an intermediary and what's their liability? Because this has been a big issue in not just in Europe, but overall, and sort of the policy on intermediary liability has been really important. And in Russia, again, the internet service providers and websites, including, say, search engines, again, face increasing pressure because right now, the Russian president has just signed the Right to be Forgotten law, which is basically, in some ways, modeled on the European version, but also puts a lot of pressure on search engines. And, it requires search engines to be the ones who respond to people's requests, who should be the ones who find the offensive content and who have to decide whether or not they want to remove it and why, and then face court prosecution if they don't. And, this is also kind of trolling. I mean, anyone can go and troll a search engine, or a website that can be called a search engine into removing stuff about them. And then this is kind of reverse trolling because you're trying to get rid of content instead of put it out there, but it's a way to stifle free expression and to change the conversation and to remove information. If you're a corrupt official and some investigative journalist or NGO wrote something about you, you have all the grounds to remove it. So I think the policy that doesn't just regulate user expression, but also the policy that regulates what the platforms behave like and what the intermediaries behave like is really, really important.
I think, can I just add, I think there's a concern. There are anti-defamation laws for a reason. Now, no, I don't think part of those laws are it has to be easy. Many times it's not easy, but there is a due process for claiming defamation. There's a bill that I understand, I think was just signed by the Senate that would require internet companies here and broad range of them to report terrorist speech, like pro-terrorist speech. And again, this goes back to my earlier point, which is this devolution of to private companies to decide what is or what is not certain type of speech. And the reason that we have laws and a court system is for those decisions to be made, according to due process. Because what we see is that, when this is devolved to companies, they tend to err on the side of caution, right? So they're going to be more likely to censor something if they think that, they're going to face repercussions by the government for, not implementing right to be forgotten or the terroristic speech issue or whatever it is. And, I just think that's very problematic. It sets a really dangerous precedent. It puts a lot of pressures on companies when they're operating, say, or have staff in repressive countries. It also makes them more susceptible to pressure because, they have staff on the ground. They have to worry about, safety and security of those staff. So, I think we really have to also look at the United States to set an example on best practices. We've already seen, the impact that the mass surveillance revelations have had on, deteriorating trust in the U.S. role in internet governance and, the trust and accountability of private companies. And so I think, the U.S. needs to do everything it can to avoid, feeding fuel to the fire.
And do you think that that's a good role for the government to play, or do you think that that's something, that we've mentioned co-regulation, we've talked about a couple of other options, some best practices purely on the platform side. What do you think the best option for kind of demonstrating the right way to do this is?
Well, I think,
Hard question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, there's this principle that we, freedom of expression advocates in the U.S. government generally, does not support intermediary liability. Well, this new proposed law seems to kind of undermine that. And we see, it's interesting. I don't know the specifics of the Delphi case, in depth. I did not read the case as you did. But, we see that, so you said that they took the comments down. The same case happened in Thailand with a woman named Ju Prachatai who ran a website. Someone made a comment that was defamatory, under lèse majesté laws in Thailand and was arrested and facing prison charges. And she took down the comment as well. So again, it just provides, it's not the right way to approach these issues. And another thing is people can choose not to read those comments. I mean, it depends what, again, trolling has a great range of commentary, but, there is also that choice. I think that's especially maybe relevant to the child issue is, the choices that we make about what to read and what communities to participate in.
And that for adults too, I think choosing not to read the comments or not engage. And also I think an important part of this is going to be counter speech and I'm really thrilled when I see celebrities on Twitter standing up to the trolls, like J.K. Rowling over the weekend coming to Serena Williams' defense and getting more people on board to speak back and to say, like, this isn't okay. And I want to see more of that online.
Yeah, well, as to the issue with Thailand, the one distinction I do see between what Europe does and what the non-Western world sometimes does, and that's a very broad generalization, is that, Europe still is our ally on free speech. I mean, I don't think it's wise to look at that case or the right to be forgotten case. There's no more free expression in Europe. I mean, they've always parted ways with us on certain things. But an important distinction that I see, and this was brought up in the right to be forgotten case too, is that Europe applies different standards to public figures. Okay, so this case, the Delphi case, and the Google versus Spain decision, those are both about supposedly non-public figures, although some would argue that Spanish guy is actually quite prominent. But the Europeans do draw the line at saying, okay, this is a tool for like an everyday citizen whose reputation is being harmed. This is not a tool for, Ron Paul to try to cover up the fact that he had racist newsletters in the 1980s. So, they do see that. And I think as we look at what defamation laws do and how they're implemented, I think you can still see a distinction between applying defamation laws to an average person and applying defamation laws to, the prime minister of a country.
But what if that average person runs for prime minister of a country?
Well, that's true. No, and that's the problem. I mean, there's a whole line of jurisprudence in the European Court of Human Rights on who is and is not a public figure. But still, I think we make those distinctions in the States. I mean, we make President Obama put up with a bunch of stuff that people say about him and his wife and kids on Twitter where, somebody else might be able to make out a defamation claim. So we make those same distinctions. And they're messy distinctions. You're right. I mean, I think, it's hazardous to get into the business of who is and who isn't a public figure. But The other thing that I see Europe struggling with, and probably to a greater degree than us, but because of the way that, I think they will tend to be more active in managing their economies, is a sort of failure to classify these types of business models. So every time, with the Google versus Spain decision, it's like, okay, well, what is a search engine exactly? What is its business model? What is its role in free speech? When you say that Google versus Spain endangered free speech, are you saying that I have a free speech right to instantaneous desktop access to some Spanish guy's bankruptcy records from 1998? Like if I needed them, I could go down to the courthouse like we did for thousands of years before there was a Google. So you can see that they're struggling with this in the Delphi case as well. And in fact, the dissent says, no, what they actually are is what we call an active internet intermediary. And they're citing these like Harvard Law Review articles about what is an active internet intermediary. So for them, Delphi with the comments, it seems to be some kind of hybrid entity that they can't pin down. So it's like, is it a publisher? Is it a hosting platform? What is it?
I think that this actually brings up a really good question. It seems from this discussion that maybe legal process and the law, not only does it take 12, 8, 15 years to kind of resolve a case like Delphi, it has a really hard time figuring out how to categorize and that kind of, it seems like a blunt object. So I think that one of the things I really wanted to talk about is what platforms can do. And I think, Greg, if you could speak to some of the learnings, developments, best practices as part of Coral Project, I think that that's a nice complement to what should the law do versus what should platforms do.
Yeah, absolutely, and because I think you're right, Heather. Right? That where law has kind of a broad scope and wide-ranging effects, what different communities and different providers can do can be a little bit more nuanced. Although the law can be very nuanced as well. I think one thing actually that I've heard from publishers is, kind of this concern about the level of civility in the comments that they have on every article. And when we talk a bit, we wind up taking that a step back and saying, well, but why do you need to have those comments there in the first place? Is that something that's absolutely critical to every article that you put on the internet? In that form, in the form that we've been using? And I would argue no. I would argue that one of the things that we're not doing as publishers and that some communities aren't doing as communities is actually thinking a little bit more strategically about what they want to do in these spaces. What kind of a question are you asking? What kind of a community are you looking to create? In a lot of cases, publishers are, putting comment threads on articles, the same kinds of comment threads we've put on articles for the past 10 years, maybe longer. And we're not really thinking very much about what we want to do in that space. There are lots of publishers, though, by the way, who are and who are crafting, really interesting, really boundary pushing interactives where users are able to communicate in a really nuanced way about a really specific topic, are able to share their thoughts, are able to gather together in a way that builds rapport and builds community, builds a hive of knowledge. So there's a lot of real good that can come out of communities that are created on publishers' sites. So this is all the kind of information that we're trying to gather together at the Coral Project to try to sort of crowdsource these best practices. And we're just kind of getting started. And so that's the kind of stuff that we're really interested in hearing about. If there are people in the audience or people in the audience out there who are, who have thoughts on that topic, we're really interested in hearing about them. You can find us on Twitter. But I think one of the things really broadly speaking that we want to do is think more strategically about these spaces as the people who provide these spaces, because we're part of the problem. If we create a space that is really freewheeling, then we're going to get answers that are really freewheeling. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to not think strategically about a space and then be shocked when what you get in there is not very good.
Well, it's interesting. That actually ties into one of the questions that folks are asking. Does an online platform inherently encourage hyperbole? Does it inherently encourage people to just go out there and be, much further? I think you touched on this when you were talking about anonymity versus real names. I think you touched on this here, talking about those platforms that aren't being intentional about what they're encouraging and how they want their community to act.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything inherent in the comment space that encourages hyperbole. I do think that I think that I guess we kind of get the communities we deserve in a way, that we'll kind of get we'll get back what we put into it. And so one of the things that I'm encouraging journalists to do, certainly in the spaces that we manage, is to participate and is to set a tone and is to help guide that tone. We have I talk about these guys a lot, but we have a blog on the Washington Post called The Capitol Weather Gang, right.
Everyone
Oh
lives
yes.
in DC. We're all nodding. We love it.
I want one of those to report on the Metro Red Line. That's like my daily disaster. That would be
much more toxic.
Well, but what's great about this community is that the people who run it, the editor of that blog and other folks who write for it, they take time and they participate and they help guide the conversation. And they've been doing this for about a decade. And what's wound up happening is that the amount of influence that they have to exert in order to keep things civil is actually now pretty minimal, because the community does that themselves. They've set a tone. This community, they geek out about weather. That's what they do. And if you come in and you want to stir the political pot for some reason or another, and they do talk about topics, by the way, that do kind of skirt into territory that could get a bit rambunctious. So they'll talk about climate change, for example, which there are people who have very strong opinions on that. But when the Capitol Weather Gang talks about it, sure, it's entirely possible somebody comes in and tries to move the conversation in a different direction. But the community, by and large, doesn't let that happen.
I love it. And I think it sounds like we're talking about creating norms. And that's one of my favorite topics when we're talking about tech policy. Yeah. I think it would be great, Jennifer, to hear a little bit about the norms that you're hoping to create in partnership with companies, and then Courtney, I know it looked like you had something to add.
Yeah, and just going off what Greg was saying, I think that's what any platform, any social media company or others needs to do is think about the type of conversations they want people to have on their network and the type of values that they as a company have as well. I think that's really important. We talk about norms a lot, not just with the companies, but with parents and with kids, and that's, we really try to encourage cyber civility, and we struggle a lot with the real name versus anonymous. I see, many great points to having anonymous speech online, but I've also heard, we just did some research with Intel Security, and 42% of the kids say they posted things anonymously, and when asked why, it's because they didn't want to be attributed with the things they were saying. And when we got into some of their behavior, they're calling people fat, they're calling people mean, they're saying things like, very hurtful and harmful things. So what we want to try to do is counter that and, discourage kids from saying these things online in the first place, get them thinking before they speak in these public forums.
Courtney?
Well, I think it's important to, again, you have to look at the broader context. And of course, the internet is global, but, the communities in the Washington Post, especially maybe on Washington weather, are relatively local, one would think. So I worked for an Arabic satellite news channel, and their approach to comments was very different, and it was to censor the majority of them. And that's also something I think that we have to be cognizant of and aware of, because we don't want to bridge into censorship. And having, I think, clearly defined rules about what the expectations are and when those comments will be removed is useful. But I also wanted to go back to something else, because I don't think that the Delphi case is the only case looming out there. And you're right, it's not just about the law, but I think we also have to be concerned when we see European leaders. There was a letter signed, I want to say, by 11 information ministers in Europe, and a visit by the French information minister to San Francisco, calling on tech companies and especially social media platforms to restrict extremist speech. And when we're talking about trolling, a lot of trolling is extremist in one way or the other. And how do we balance the need to restrict extremism, but also recognize that extremism in one area is not maybe extremism in another, or in one time, at some point, advocating for the right for a woman to vote was an extreme position. So we have to be, I think, very, nuanced and careful about that. And, I love the fact that we're talking about norms, because I think the best way to counter, this negative speech is with creating normative communities. But, there definitely are cases of trolling where, you can't counteract threatening speech. It's still perceived as a threat by that person and can impact how they react. And there's an interesting case now that's being perceived by journalists working in Egypt, and they're perceiving it as trolling because there's this new department called like Fact Check Egypt that specifically is this trolling? I don't know, they're perceiving it as trolling, but they specifically look at how foreign reporters are covering Egypt, and when they don't like it, they go after that person and try to correct it or whatever, lambast them. And another issue is, going back to norms, is with the PR firms that are being hired by some of these companies to do their social media strategy, which often incorporates aspects of trolling. That's where normative power can be really useful as well, because many of them are American. We know, for example, Corvus Communications, I think, was one of the Bahraini firms. So, if we can also bring moral pressure on the people who are providing, the support that enables this nefarious trolling, I think that's another way that we could use norms.
So when we're creating these norms, these kind of community rules and expectations, is there a role for things like feedback mechanisms? Someone on Twitter mentioned, for example, the Reddit upvote, downvote, that in some cases seems to be a really effective way to encourage good speech, and in some ways, I think may also highlight things that you might consider trolling. Tanya?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good that we can say about a mechanism like upvoting and downvoting, but then again, that also, we must not sort of view this as like a, here's a solution, it works for everyone, because depending on which community you're in, the community may impose their own norms through a seemingly democratic process of voting up and down. But if the community is toxic, then it'll just be a toxic voting up and down. So it's not just there's not like a Deus ex machina here where like, oh, we'll just use this tool and it'll all be great. Just as very very few things that are automated just work. You have to have a human element, and very often when we are talking about setting norms, it's cool to have tools, but you also have to have the values present, and you have to articulate them very clearly. And then, as you say, that can help people manage their expectations, because then people won't just know that they can upvote and downvote, but they also know that if they see trolling behavior, they can decide, whether they want to counteract or they just want to not engage, but that it will be clear to everyone, what this person is doing and what their choices are and how they can protect themselves if they want to. And again, if there is somebody who is engaging in behavior that's threatening, and sending out either gender-based or otherwise based threats to someone, then the community will know, that this is something they can either downvote or report, or, how to engage with this person. So I think, mechanisms are fun, and some of them work better than others, but values and sort of managing expectations and being very clear, both by platforms as platforms who provide services such as Facebook, and content providers, websites like Washington Post or Global Voices, be very, very clear about what sort of behavior they seek to build in their community spaces online.
On this issue about violent extremism, which I think poses a different set of challenges even than defamation or just lack of civility. I attended a very interesting panel discussion in Strasbourg at the Cybercrime Conference a few weeks ago, and I was particularly intrigued at the Norwegian approach. And it was very ironic. I mean, the French panelist was there and talking about taking down content and how important it is to take down the content. A very sharp Pakistani lawyer sitting next to me at some point interjected and said, you don't understand, when you take down the ISIS flag, you're taking down actually the seal of Muhammad, and all you're doing is making you guys look like a bunch of hypocrites. But the Norwegian approach, I thought, was very intriguing. And of course, as I'm listening to him, I'm sitting there with my Wi-Fi connection and seeing something about some shooting in Charleston in a church, so right. Wasn't exactly in a position to deny that, violent extremism facilitated online is a problem. But the Norwegians, what I liked about them is, first of all, they're trying to come to terms with both Islamic and right-wing extremism, because they're still trying to figure out how this thing with Breivik happened. And, they find what is a real struggle is to allow this free speech, but then find the moment where that one person is about to turn violent. And in fact, they almost caught the guy who went to Kenya and committed a terrorist attack. They had some information that he had become radicalized, but they just couldn't connect the dots enough to keep him from getting on a plane. But what they believe in is an overt police presence on some of these sites, not a covert presence. And they're trying to create reporting structures so that people will come to them and say when these people have become radicalized. Because what they find is that the radicalization can't happen solely in the online world. It also has to happen in the offline world. There has to be some sort of offline connection. And kids are joining ISIS because of ISIS's successes on the battlefield, not on the internet. So I think dealing with the violent extremism, it's just you kind of have to remind people there's okay, the internet is not the enemy here. Yeah, it's a useful conduit for people, and people are doing some very clever things. There was an excellent article, I think in the New York Times, about an American Christian young woman who was radicalized through social media by ISIS. But you have to realize that there's a conduit, and that you've got to hit at the offline connections and planning that are going on. I mean, it sounded like a recruitment to a religious cult is what it sounded like. It was like, well, we know that works in the offline world too. I mean, we still remember Jim Jones and going off to jungle in Guyana. It sounds like all the same kind of techniques, just using the internet as a conduit. But yeah, look into the Norwegian approach. Yeah. It's very interesting.
But then you hear about partnerships like the U.S. partnership with the Emirates, around this issue, and you think, okay, well, maybe we trust the U.S. government to decide that, okay, this is real extremist speech. But in the Emirates, they've locked up, 94 human rights activists and journalists, and so we also see in the, wake of 9/11 how, anti-terrorism policies got interpreted by repressive governments to crack down on dissent. And, I think that's really the concern with the violent extremism approach. And so how do you yes, legitimately counter the extremism, but not also provide an opening for other governments who will use it as an excuse to restrict dissent or criticism?
Good question.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on that one.
I mean, if we had a silver bullet here, we wouldn't have a panel because it wouldn't be very interesting.
Sure.
I think one of the you mentioned Charleston. I think that everyone here has at least a few examples of kind of toxic speech that was part of a bigger movement that was or that began a massive outpouring of toxic speech. Is that different than kind of your not your state-sponsored actor and not your individual who is spewing whatever trolling, toxic speech you'd like to think? I'm thinking a little bit of, there's been some interesting stuff on Reddit over the last week. There's been Gamergate, some other examples of things where there was some traction for speech that you really, in my opinion, wouldn't want traction for. Is there a way to kind of address that, think about that, best practices, or is that just up to the platform to figure out those best practices?
I mean, it's a tremendously interesting time to be talking about this topic, right? I mean, what we've seen at Reddit just over the past week I think will have ripple effects as we go. I know certainly as we're getting started on the project I'm working on, we're definitely keeping an eye on all of that. I mean, I think it's difficult to. Okay, wow, here's a statement. Get this one down. It's difficult to paint the internet with a broad brush. I know. I'm sorry I made news. But it is. And so when I think, different forums are going to be different forums. And I think, I think what we can, certainly, thinking as a publisher, what we can do is, try to create the best forum that we can. And hopefully try to make a space that we can make as good as possible, as so that people can talk about issues and really get things out there. I think that each of us who does manage a space where people talk we have, I think, that imperative, kind of that moral imperative ourselves to try to craft a really good space. Are there going to be, the internet is a pretty wild and woolly place. Are there going to be places where stuff happens that we don't like? Absolutely. I'm not sure what we can do about that, but I know that we can make the spaces that, that we manage, that we have something to do with, better spaces by each one of us kind of trying to do our part there. And that can be managing a space, or that can be contributing to one.
So last night, and we were preparing for this panel, Mike Nelson sent around an ebook, The Internet of Garbage.
Zhang, and
Yeah.
I think it's the Internet of Garbage.
Yeah, no, I mean, she made some really good points in there, which, with this idea that we can regulate and try to, regulate based on content or based on behavior. And she's essentially making the argument for behavior in what I found a very persuasive way, because I think that you can then get around some of the, freedom of expression issues because you are focused on the behavior. And also she made the point that there was a misguided media narrative around the Gamergate issue and scandal and that whole thing, because a lot of those trolls were not anonymous. They were, previously related and known to the victim. And so I think that's also important. And that harkens back to something that I would emphasize, which is the importance of the media to report well on these issues and, not to just go with the easy trope or, but really to explain well and dig into the details and not, paint a broad stroke about, whatever the issue is, because it is important to realize that, the doxing attacks were not by anonymous random trolls who, showed up once in a forum, right? It was by an ex-boyfriend or whatever. And this idea that, the difference between somebody who, throws out some vile comment once versus a continuous 3-month, haranguing on someone's blog. So anyways, maybe we can tweet out the name of the book. I thought,
I'll find the book.
Provided some interesting ways of thinking about these issues that can help, resolve in a positive way this tension.
And I want to just maybe continue that thought by illustrating this by a story from the Russian internet. Fairly recently, obviously there's some anti-LGBT and anti-gay sentiment in Russia. There's a law against gay propaganda. But actually, sociologists and anthropologists say that the majority of Russians are actually kind of indifferent, like they don't really care, they have other things they worry about. But if you go to specific places on the Russian internet, especially, the web pages set up by LGBT groups who seek to help LGBT people in Russia, you see a lot of hate there. And it seems like that's all it is. But, that's actually just a kind of a concentrated picture. And so one of the more prominent activist, Lena Klimova, who runs an organization for LGBT youth. It's called Children 404. Who work with LGBT children, or have been either kicked out of their homes or hurt or otherwise disadvantaged. So she receives quite a lot of hateful comments on her social media pages, and she did kind of almost like an art project once, where she looked at the profiles of the people who were sending her these comments, and she took some sort of very mundane, very nice photos of those people, like with their dogs or cats or their families or their kids, and juxtaposed them with the comments they were writing to her. And she created a photo album which she put on Facebook, and I thought that was such a great and a very brave thing to do, obviously, but also just such a great way to show that actually, these are not just some anonymous sock puppets or trolls. These are normal people who, for some reason, think that in this particular space, they can behave in this very hateful way, whereas in other spaces, they are totally normal, seemingly, and lead normal lives, and have families and children and whatever. So I think that was a very good way of sort of turning the discussion around and saying, well, if you think you can do this, maybe think about why. Like, why are you, I'm just like you. I'm a person. I have a life. I have a thing that I love to do, and so do you. But why do you think you can behave in this particular way? So I thought that was a very interesting way to comment on both the sort of values and also, as you say, why is there a movement is it just because they see everybody else doing it and think they can also get in on the action and it'll pass under the radar and they'll feel like they've, expressed their anti-LGBT sentiment or but I thought that was a very good visual comment on the picture.
So we have about 20 minutes. If there are any questions in the room or more questions on Twitter, I am happy to toss that over. If there are any.
I was just going to add on, there was something, and I think it was around Gamergate, where there was a woman who was talking about how she was being trolled and all of this stuff. And when one of the troll's mothers found out, he had been using, I think, his name on Twitter, he apologized to her publicly because his mom found out, and he was shamed, by what he was doing. And I think that sometimes, like your story of humanizing, like these are real people, and especially when we're talking about it with kids, like getting them to realize like they can really hurt people and like reconsider maybe what they've done.
Yeah. Well, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, in addition to, those issues, I mean, there was making sure that law enforcement understands the range of trolling and knows how to respond, because I think there have also been reports, at least in this country, of women specifically going to the police to report threats that are a danger to their life, or again, doxing attacks, and the police have no idea and might not even know what Twitter is.
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that kind of that kind of knowledge really helps when it comes to law enforcement. I was just going to piggyback and say, just I've had personal experiences at the Post, talking with commenters, both sort of in comment threads and outside of them. You'll be surprised to hear, I think, that sometimes when people write in to customer service, they're not always as polite as they might be if they were talking to you one-on-one. But what I've found is that when I wind up responding to those, which I do a lot, that the tenor almost instantly changes in most cases, where somebody kind of starts out with with the thumb screws out and kind of ready to go for me. Then when I respond back, as hi, I'm a person, and I hear what you're saying, and here's what I'm doing to try to help you, the tenor of the response usually changes. I found the same thing in a comment thread. We had some trouble with our comments software on the Post, and I started writing about it on the site, and inviting commenters to come in and talk about what kinds of experiences they were having and how we might be able to solve them and that sort of thing. So a place where people are already coming from a place of frustration, but seeing that a person was interacting with them really helped to change the tenor. And there's actually research on this as well. The Engaging News Project, which is a group out of the University of Texas at Austin, did a study earlier this year that said that journalists participating in comment threads or other interactives can actually raise the level of civility in those spaces. And I think you might be able to, I'm no scientist, but I think you might be able to extrapolate that out to other types of communities as well.
Hi, I'm Carrie Jack.
Is it on?
Just raise that,
And I'm a Luddite also.
That's okay. If
up towards yourself, there's a little. Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Is it working? Hi, I'm proud to be a Luddite, actually, and I'm pulling back more of my social experience than I've had online before. It's not up.
Oh, well, that sounded like it was on. Or that was yours. Yeah.
There we go.
I found it.
Got it. There we go.
I will make my sons proud of me. I ran out of writing space and I stopped writing because there was too much to contribute to. I am a journalist. You actually built the first discrete site crime analysis lab on a college campus on the continent. So I take a little bit of umbrage to comments about law enforcement. I worked with them on a 911. I quarterbacked a PD. So I know who showed up to take care of people and who stayed away. Back then, when I built my crime lab, I came up with a phrase called psychological homelessness. Now, we're talking back around 1990s, 2000. Around the time of 9/11, I was actively there. And I used that term to describe, to project forward a mindset that I was watching people move to. There was no accountability to talk into a computer box, and everybody talks as we type, we know that. And I was projecting then that people were going to be building fantasy worlds, again with no accountability. We've created what we have today, and as a journalist, and I reformed or retired, I think reformed, we're accountable because many people that we allow to call themselves journalists don't do the fact checking that the Missouri Journalism Center has out there as our CODIS to follow. Case in point, recently we had the South Carolina shooter. Laura, you talked about the Delphi, the wedding cake situation. I never heard the other part of the story that you just told us, but there's another part to the South Carolina shooter. I do tech trails, and I looked immediately at the who is and found it went to Russia. Knowing about the anonymity projects that State Department funded and encouraged, these little underground tunnels you talked about. For one, do not believe that that Russia's involved with it. I think someone tipped it there. So everybody jumps off in these ways of not doing diligence and taking a deep breath. And in terms of your project, Greg, one of the healthiest things that you can advise people is take a breath. Do your diligence. I post screen grabs when I research things. And by the way, I also looked at your bio. The Express posted something about the Jefferson Davis being under attack as the next place to take down the name. It's already happened. On one of my sites, I have it up there. It's called the Jeff Davis Highway. So just a couple of points to kick in there as to, we have to remember we are the problem. And it's not just journalists, it's everybody in this room that thinks that you're not accountable for what you say. We totally are.
So how do we encourage that kind of diligence and that moment to take a breath before you fire off the angry comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, take a. Well, I guess what I could say to you is that I think take a breath is that would look really great on a button, because and I think it's really good advice. I mean, I think that's one of the things, right? I mean, it's and that goes beyond the internet, right? I think certainly a lot of the biggest mistakes I've made is when I haven't thought about what I'm going to say before I say it. But yeah, I mean, I think that certainly what we want to do, with at the Washington Post, but then also I think what we want to encourage with the Coral Project is for people to be thoughtful in their contributions and to realize that they are contributing to a community. This isn't kind of just a personal scratch pad, but it's a place where people are debating ideas, and that debate can be pointed. That debate can be rigorous, but it should be civil, and you should treat people the way you want to be treated. I've heard that before. It sounds like good advice.
Part of the solution to taking a breath is knowing the liability of when you do something. I would tell people, if you're going to hit someone, don't be shocked if they whack you back. The whack back these days is jurisdiction. Every time the Post or State Department has a comment box, you've asked someone to set up a user word, to set up a password. You have created the legal jurisdiction to be sued. So whether it's your entity or whether it's the contributor, don't be shocked if you get sued. And that has to be paired with the education of, you're going to get sued, think twice about it. What are you willing to lose?
Well, and that actually brings up an interesting question off of the Twitter feed. And this is less about creating civil speech and more about what is the impact of, for example, the DOJ subpoenaing information about commenters? Is that going to encourage civil speech? Is that just a shot into the darkness? Is that going to help kind of the law enforcement efforts around this? Is that going to chill speech? What do you
At
think?
least they're using a subpoena, not the NSA surveillance powers.
All right, we can get behind that.
Yeah, but I think also in terms of thinking about this more broadly, and I'm a Russia journalist. That's my beat. So I'm always thinking about the less transparent and the less due diligence countries who are very fond of looking at the Western laws and saying, hey, look, they adopted this law. Let's adopt a very similar law, only, we'll use it in totally different ways.
Without institutional protections.
Yeah, and I mean, and then they'll do. So Russia also has a law, that is an anti-extremism law, but then they have a very vague definition of what they consider extremism, and you can get. So very often they just use it as a pretext to crack down on activists or people who are expressing themselves. And I think, it's a lot to ask, but I think Western governments should be very thoughtful also about how they sort of write their laws and how they manage, because everybody else is sort of looking up to them as this standard. And I mean, the same goes for, you know, your European Union and their laws as well.
And I think, you know, in terms of asking about what platforms can do, I mean, that seems, you know, it seems like more about the individual commenting troll versus the organized, if not government-sponsored, you know, certainly coming from, you know, a given government's position, either by hired or, you know, trolls or PR firms. And, you know, I feel like we haven't really come to a solution for that. I don't know that there is a solution, but I think that, you know, creating a civil space isn't really going to matter if you've been hired to post, you know, X number of negative comments, or, you know, on the other side, if you've created some sort of, you know, botnet that goes out and, you know, floods a given hashtag or whatever. You know, there have been conferences where, you know, we've just decided not to use a country hashtag because it's too, you know, leads to too much vitriol or too much irrelevant content. But I also would echo what Tanya said in terms of, you know, Egypt, for example, with its extremism law, is so broad brush, and as you probably know, captures anyone who has affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. And, you know, there is no due process there. There have been, you know, hundreds of people put to death, sentenced to death, you know, journalists in prison for covering Muslim Brotherhood protests. And, you know, I can't echo it enough, and because we have someone from the U.S. government here, how important it is to realize that, you know, U.S. internet governance and the choices that we make in this space have broad repercussions way beyond this space that really impact the ability of journalists, activists, and the publics in other countries to access information and express themselves.
Just two really quick thoughts on, you know, what governments can do that can be effective in this space. I do think the promotion of social and emotional learning in schools, like there's an education element, and that's a really good role for the government to be able to promote and encourage schools to teach kids from a young age about, you know, that you need to behave the same way offline and online is one key point, I think. And, you know, the government shouldn't be rushing to criminalize behavior, particularly when it comes to young people around speech online. That diversionary programs and education, I think, will be really, really important instead.
Mm-hmm. I think we have just a few minutes. If there's another question in the audience.
I have just quick comments. I don't know whether to be questions, but my name is Arsène, and I'm from the Congo. Thank you so much for this presentation and all the insightful contributions that you've made on this topic. I think I agree. I'm a blogger, by the way. I'm a blogger, and I usually use those platforms that allow you as a blogger to approve or disapprove some comments in order to make your blog look the way you want it to look. The contents you want people to read, and the comments you want people to see, because there's that way of thinking as well. And I think it's good as well, those platforms that allows people to like or dislike a certain comment, because that has proved, as you've noted as well, to change behavior of some people. Because when someone posted a comment and they see so many people just disliked the comments, sometimes they feel like, oh well, so my comment was not appropriate, and maybe next time they will change the way they're making public comments. Also, lastly, maybe taking a look at some politicians or some public figures, people who have, for instance, blogs or Facebook pages or those kind of social media platforms. I think it's also good sometimes to check on the comments of people in order to help you evaluate or to see the way people see the way you're doing things. Because sometimes when you post something which is publicly something about, as a politician, what you are doing, and you can feel the sense or the temperature of your readers, whether this is good or not, based on the comments that they'll be posting. Sometimes those comments may be rude or maybe the comments that you don't want to hear or what you don't want people to say about your policy or your actions. But sometimes I think it's good to feel what people feel about you. And I think the same thing would appear here, as I said, for any public figure, for instance, for journalists as well. For instance, as a publisher, you may have your own Facebook page, for instance, and you can see what people think about the post that you are posting, right? And those comments can be sometimes rude, or I don't know, you don't like them, but I think you don't need to delete them, for instance, because that will help you to see what people think of the work you're doing.
I think that's a good point. I think it's a good point that comments that are critical are not trolling necessarily.
Oh, exactly. No, absolutely. And that was great. And I'd love to underscore two things that you said there. One, this notion of transparency. As publishers, as people who run forums, giving a good idea, a discussion policy, but even beyond that, some interaction that says, okay, this was really great, and let me tell you why, or this didn't really. What do you think about this? And sometimes it's not as it's not as clear cut as this is a comment that I want to delete. It might be more just kind of pivoting the conversation a bit, right, to something that might be a little bit more might be a bit more useful. And then you also mentioned the notion of changing behavior, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I wanted to be sure that we did here, because trolls aren't necessarily born that way, right? It's a learned behavior, and it's one that can change. If people show up to a pie fight, they're going to pick up a pie, right? But if people show up to a reasoned discussion, then that pie it's not so appropriate. Maybe it's dessert. So I think that's that's something to keep in mind as well, that you can change this behavior. And if I can jump on one more thing, a lot of what we've discussed today, talking about people, people on internet sites saying that the people should be the horrible things that they wanted to do to that guy in Estonia, or other things. Why on earth do we have these spaces, right? I mean, it sounds like they're pretty horrible, and they're not. Not all of them. And I think that one of the things that we can do is look at the spaces that are going well. Look at the kinds of areas where this sort of discussion is bringing more light than heat, and trying to see if we can emulate those. I'll give you a couple of examples beyond the one that I already gave you about weather, because who doesn't love weather? But at the Post, we have a few communities that have really started to grow online, and that are really quite civil. There's one that has grown up along one of our reporters named Joel Achenbach, and it's been a community that's been around for about 10 years. And they talk about what Joel writes, but then they also talk about each other's lives. They meet in person. When one of them unfortunately passed away within the past year, they got together and had a gathering to celebrate her life. These are people who matter to each other, and so you can create communities where not just ideas are exchanged, but where people actually sort of gain personal interactions with each other and with us as people who work at the Washington Post, but then also as our brand. And so from a business perspective, that's really helpful to us, but from a personal perspective, it is too. I'll give you one more example. At the New York Times, there's a series of articles that was done called Paying Till It Hurts, and it was talking about Obamacare and some trouble that people have had around that. And the reporter who put that series together set up a Facebook group where she invited people who were having trouble with healthcare to come together and talk about that. That Facebook group still exists. It's got almost 7,000 people on it. It's updated really regularly by regular people. And what happens is folks come in, they talk about their healthcare experiences, they help each other, and then the reporter from the Times has actually used this space as a breeding ground for articles that she can write that sort of bring to light some of the problems that real people have found. So these spaces can be really beneficial. It's just a matter of structuring them the right way and giving people the incentive to come in and be thoughtful.
I think that is a fantastic note to end on. Does everyone want to go through and have a last word? Who wants to start?
Sure. Well, I would say, if you want to have a robust global defense of free expression, I would advise people to read or reread, if you haven't looked at it since you were an undergrad, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Because I think, when you're in global dialogue, you start to realize that where the U.S. is on free speech is like way farther than almost any other country on earth. I mean, even the Canadians think we're over the top sometimes. And so, to read John Stuart Mill is to read his articulation of, well, why is free expression important? What societal value does this hold, given that it can do so much harm? And, he believed that, it promotes a better informed citizenry. It puts more ideas out into the marketplace of ideas, more participatory government, a more knowledgeable citizen base, which is essential to democracy. We need our citizens to be well informed for democracy to function. And so, it's not only a way to defend free speech for people who, in Russia, for example, who didn't grow up reading John Stuart Mill and just really didn't get the memo on all this. But I think it's also a good guidepost for some of the forums that you're moderating to say, okay, is this interaction actually furthering the societal goals that made us value free expression in the first place? And if not, maybe I should try something different.
Jennifer?
Yeah, and just to go along that and to echo what Greg was saying, I think that we got to a really good place by talking about how much positive stuff happens. We need to find ways to mitigate the really bad things on the internet and to deal with trolling. It's a struggle. It's a balance all of the time between safety and free expression. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there are amazing conversations happening online and so many platforms and new ones popping up all of the time. And I think that's exciting and it's great for young people. And I think that there's a lot that parents, kids, and companies need to be thinking about in this space.
Yeah, I think we've been talking quite a lot on the sort of macro level, and I want to take this down a little bit to the individual micro level. There are two schools of thought on how to react to trolls. One is don't feed the trolls, and the other one is feed them till they choke, which a good friend of mine subscribes to. I fall somewhere in the middle. I think if you do want to try and engage with trolls, either on your own page or, on an issue that you care about, question them. Mm-hmm. Ask them why they think what they told you. Mm-hmm. Draw them out. And, I've seen some good examples where people actually started thinking about what they're saying and not necessarily always changed their mind, but at least sort of became a little more weighed and balanced on the issues they were trolling you initially on.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex issue because we're talking on the one hand about, the old-fashioned troll who just wants to go out there and stir up debate, all, through to the, really violent, threatening person, through to, government-endorsed or sponsored trolling. And it's difficult, especially, I think, as a press freedom organization and as an advocate, because on the one hand, we're very concerned about women journalists and journalists more generally who are threatened. I mean, Nick Kristof was trolled and got death threats after his visit to Bahrain. So we are concerned about the safety aspect of that and the broader chilling effect it has. And on the other hand, we're also concerned about how do you keep the space open for free speech, for reporting. And, I think that this is a good start of a conversation. I think that we need to continue having it. And it's especially valuable to have, kind of the human rights and the children's rights people together, because there are very different communities working on this subject. And it's important that we're in conversation with each other so that the different dimensions are considered and we can figure out the best approaches and best practices that will have the maximum positive impact for a variety of communities.
Yes, thank you all. This was fantastic. Thank you for your engagement. I'm really glad that we talked about, constructive things that we can be doing rather than just wringing our hands about how terrible the troll problem is. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.